Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. It's a second chance at what you thought you'd lost forever. Neil Carson was 59 years old when a letter arrived that would change his life. A distant uncle he barely remembered had left him an old hotel in rural Nebraska. The place was falling apart, forgotten for nearly 40 years. Neil saw it as a way to start over and maybe reconnect with his son who had drifted away. But when they opened a sealed wall in the back office, they found a leather ledger filled with names and dates. The book told stories that weren't supposed to exist. What was this hotel really used for, and why did someone hide the truth? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Neil Carson's apartment in Cleveland smelled like coffee and sawdust. It was a small place, third floor of a building that had seen better decades, but it was his. The morning light came through windows that rattled when trucks passed on the street below. He'd lived here for 8 years, ever since the divorce became final and the house went to his ex-wife. Fair enough. She'd raised their boy mostly on her own, while Neil worked double shifts on construction sites across the city. He sat at his kitchen table now, the letter spread before him like a map to somewhere he'd never planned to go. The law firm's letterhead was crisp, formal, and completely out of place next to his chipped coffee mug and the want ads he'd been circling. Attorney Douglas Pembroke of Pembroke and Associates in Lincoln, Nebraska. The words swam together when he tried to read them again. Dear Mr. Carson, it is our duty to inform you that your uncle, Harold Carson, passed away on September 3rd of this year. As the sole surviving relative named in his will, you are the beneficiary of his estate, which includes the Prairie Vista Hotel and surrounding property of approximately 14 acres. Harold Carson. Neil had to dig through his memory like sorting through a box in a dusty attic. He'd met the man twice, maybe 3 times. Once at a family reunion when Neil was 7 or 8, Harold had been quiet, standing at the edge of conversations, smiling but not saying much. The second time was at Neil's grandmother's funeral, 20-some years ago. Harold had driven all the way from Nebraska, stayed for the service, shook Neil's hand, and driven back the same day. That was the extent of it. No phone calls at Christmas, no birthday cards, no relationship to speak of. And now the man had left him a hotel. Neil picked up his phone and stared at it. He should call Kyle. His son would want to know, wouldn't he? Or maybe Kyle wouldn't care. Their conversations had become polite and short over the years, reduced to text messages on holidays and the occasional phone call that felt like an obligation on both ends. Kyle was 28 now, living in Chicago, doing something with computers and design that Neil didn't fully understand. He had a nice apartment, from what Neil could tell from the one time Kyle had video called him. Clean walls, modern furniture, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Not like this place, where the refrigerator hummed too loud and the bathroom faucet dripped no matter how many times Neil tried to fix it. He pulled up Kyle's contact and typed, "Got some strange news. Uncle Harold died. Left me a hotel in Nebraska. Weird, right?" The response came faster than expected. "Uncle who?" Neil smiled despite himself. "Exactly." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "A hotel? Like a real hotel?" "Apparently. Lawyer says it's mine. No debts, just property." "Are you going to check it out?" Neil stared at the question. Was he? What else was there to do? The construction company had laid him off 3 weeks ago. Last hired, first fired, the foreman had said apologetically. His knee still ached from the fall that had put him out of work for 2 months last year. The medical bills sat in a drawer, unpaid, accruing interest he couldn't afford. Thinking about it, he typed. The dots again. Then, want company? Neil's chest tightened. He read the message 3 times, making sure he understood it correctly. You'd take time off work? I've got vacation days. Haven't seen you since last Christmas. Could be interesting. It was the most enthusiasm Kyle had shown about spending time with him in years. Neil felt something shift in his chest, something that had been locked tight for too long. I'd like that, he typed. Then, before he could second-guess himself, I'd really like that. They made plans over the next few days. Kyle would fly into Omaha, and Neil would drive out from Cleveland, meet him there, and they'd drive together to the hotel. The lawyer had sent pictures, a 2-story building made of red brick and weathered wood, sitting alone on a flat stretch of prairie. It looked abandoned, forgotten, the kind of place that time had left behind. Neil spent a week preparing. He packed his tools in the bed of his pickup truck, hammers, saws, levels, everything he might need if the place needed work, which it would, judging by the photographs. Broken windows, sagging porch, weeds growing up through cracks in the parking lot. He found himself thinking about Harold more than he expected. What kind of man leaves a hotel to someone he barely knows? Neil tried to remember conversations, any hint that Harold had thought of him over the years. But there was nothing. Just those 2 brief encounters, and then silence. The drive west took 2 days. Neil stopped at cheap motels, ate at truck stops, watched the landscape flatten out as he left Ohio and crossed into Iowa. The Midwest opened up before him. Endless fields, small towns that looked like they were holding their breath, grain elevators rising against big skies. He picked Kyle up at the Omaha airport on a Thursday afternoon. His son looked good, thinner than Neil remembered, wearing dark jeans and a button-up shirt that probably cost more than Neil's entire wardrobe. Kyle's hair was shorter, styled in a way that looked effortless, but probably wasn't. They hugged briefly, awkwardly, the way they always did now. Good flight? Neil asked. Long, Kyle said, tossing his bag in the truck bed. But fine. They drove south and west, following the lawyer's directions toward a town called Whitman, population, 200. The conversation came in fits and starts, work, weather, neutral topics that didn't require much from either of them. Kyle scrolled through his phone, checking emails. Neil kept his eyes on the road. So what are you thinking? Kyle asked eventually. About the hotel? Don't know yet, Neil said. Figured I'd see it first. And then? And then I'll figure it out. Kyle nodded, went back to his phone. The silence stretched between them, familiar and uncomfortable. But there was something else, too. Something Neil hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, maybe. Or possibility. His son was sitting next to him by choice, and they were driving toward something unknown together. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had in years. The sun was setting when they finally turned off the highway onto a gravel road. The sign was weathered, barely legible. Prairie Vista Hotel, 2 miles. Neil slowed down, feeling his heart pick up speed. Beside him, Kyle put his phone away and leaned forward, looking through the windshield. The hotel appeared gradually, rising out of the flatland like something from another era. 2 stories of red brick, worn and faded. Windows dark, some broken. A porch that sagged in the middle. The parking lot was cracked concrete, weeds pushing through everywhere. Neil pulled to a stop in front of the building and killed the engine. They sat in silence, staring. Well, Kyle said finally, it's definitely a hotel. Neil almost laughed. That it is. He got out of the truck, his knee protesting as he stepped down. The evening air was cool, carrying the smell of grass and dust. The prairie stretched in every direction, empty and vast. The hotel stood alone in all that space, waiting. Kyle came around the truck, hands in his pockets. "You have keys?" Neil held up the envelope the lawyer had sent. "Right here." They walked to the front door together, their footsteps loud on the wooden porch. Neil fitted the key into the lock, felt it turn with a reluctant click. The door swung open on hinges that groaned. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. Neil found a light switch and flipped it, not expecting anything. To his surprise, a few overhead bulbs flickered to life, casting dim yellow light across a lobby frozen in time. The lobby smelled like old paper and something else Neil couldn't quite name. Time, maybe, or memory. Dust motes swirled in the weak light from bulbs that had probably been installed decades ago. The registration desk stood against the far wall, its surface covered in a thick layer of grime. Behind it, a wooden rack held room keys on brass hooks, most still in place. Kyle stepped inside cautiously, like he was entering a museum after hours. "This is actually kind of amazing." Neil moved toward the desk, his boots leaving prints in the dust on the floor. The tile was cracked in places, a pattern of black and white squares that had probably looked sharp once. Now it just looked tired. A calendar hung on the wall behind the desk, turned to March 1982, 42 years ago. "He just walked away and left it," Neil said quietly. "Looks like it." They explored slowly, opening doors, looking into rooms. The ground floor had a dining area with tables still set with napkins and salt shakers. The kitchen beyond was industrial-sized, with equipment that belonged in a restaurant. Stainless steel counters, a massive stove, a walk-in cooler that hummed faintly when Neil opened it, somehow still running. "Why would he keep the power on?" Kyle asked. "Don't know. Maybe he thought he'd come back." They climbed the stairs to the second floor. The wood creaked under their weight, but felt solid enough. A hallway ran the length of the building with doors on both sides. Neil counted 12 rooms total. He opened the first door and found a simple space, iron bed frame, small dresser, a window that looked out over the prairie. The wallpaper was peeling, faded flowers on a cream background. Photographs hung in the hallway, protected by glass in simple frames. Neil paused to look at them. Black and white images mostly. Groups of people standing in front of the hotel, smiling at the camera. Some showed men in military uniforms. Others showed families, parents with children, suitcases at their feet. "Who were all these people?" Kyle asked, studying a photo of a young couple with an infant. "Guests, I guess, from back when the place was running." Kyle took out his phone and started photographing the pictures. "These are incredible. Look at the detail." They continued down the hall, checking each room. Most were similar. Sparse, functional, clean despite the dust. But they'd been left intact, as if the guests had simply checked out one day and never come back. At the end of the hall they found a door marked "Office Private." Neil tried the handle, locked. He dug through the keys the lawyer had sent until he found one that fit. The door opened into a small room with a desk, filing cabinets, and a window that overlooked the back of the property. More dust here, thicker than elsewhere. Papers covered the desk, receipts, ledgers, correspondence. Kyle moved to the filing cabinets and pulled open a drawer. It was full of folders, neatly labeled by year. "Your uncle kept good records," Kyle said. Neil sat in the desk chair, feeling it creak under him. He opened the top drawer and found pens, paper clips, rubber bands, normal office supplies. The second drawer held a guest book, its pages yellowed but still readable. He flipped through it, seeing names written in fountain pen, dates going back to the 1950s. "Hey, Dad!" Neil looked up. Kyle was standing by the wall, running his hand along the wood paneling. "What is it?" "This sounds different." Kyle knocked on the wall. The sound was hollow. Neil stood and joined him. Kyle was right. The section of wall sounded wrong, like there was empty space behind it. Neil pressed his palm against the panel, feeling along the edges. His fingers found a gap, almost invisible, running along one side. "There's a seam here," he said. Kyle leaned his weight against the panel. It shifted slightly. They both pushed, and with a sharp crack, the panel gave way, swinging inward on a hidden hinge. Behind it was a shallow compartment, maybe 2 feet deep, and inside, resting on a wooden shelf, was a leather-bound book wrapped in oilcloth. Neil reached in carefully, his heart suddenly pounding. The oilcloth was brittle but intact. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a ledger bound in dark brown leather. The cover was embossed with the words Prairie Vista Hotel in gold letters that had faded, but were still legible. Kyle crowded close as Neil carried the book to the desk and set it down. He opened the cover carefully. The first page was blank except for a date written in neat handwriting. January 1952. He turned the page. What followed was a list of names, each with a date beside it. But these weren't like the entries in the guest book. There were no addresses, no payment information. Instead, each name had brief notes beside it. James Hutchinson, March 12, 1952. Veteran, Purple Heart, needs rest. Wife and infant daughter. Franklin Shaw, June 3, 1952. Traveling north. Safe passage needed. The Morrison family, August 15, 1953. 5 days. Children ages 6, 8, 11. Neil turned page after page, his confusion growing. The entries continued through the 1950s, into the 1960s and 1970s. Some had additional notes. Arrived late, used back entrance. Stayed 2 weeks, arranged transport. No questions asked. Kyle was reading over his shoulder. "What is this?" "I don't know." But even as he said it, Neil felt something clicking into place. The photographs in the hallway, he'd seen something in them, something he hadn't fully registered. He stood and went back to the hallway, Kyle following. He studied the photos more carefully now, the families, the servicemen. And then he saw it. Most of the people in the photographs were black. Neil thought about the dates in the ledger, the 1950s, 60s, 70s. He thought about the notes. Safe passage. No questions asked. Used back entrance. "Kyle," he said quietly, "look at these pictures. Really look at them." Kyle studied them, his expression shifting as he understood. "Dad, was this place—" "I think so," Neil said. "I think Uncle Harold was helping people who needed somewhere safe to stay." They went back to the office, to the ledger. Neil turned pages more purposefully now, reading entries with new understanding. References to veterans who couldn't find lodging elsewhere. Families traveling through dangerous areas. Notes about keeping guests' presence quiet, using discretion. One entry from 1963 stopped him. The Fletcher family. Emergency arrival. 3-week stay. Arranged safe transport north. Grateful for sanctuary. The word hung in the air. Sanctuary. Kyle pulled out his phone and started typing. "The Green Book," he said after a moment. "Have you heard of it?" "No." It was a guide for black travelers. Listed safe places to stay, restaurants that would serve them, gas stations where they wouldn't be turned away. "Dad, I think Uncle Harold's hotel might have been one of those places." Neil sat down slowly, the weight of it settling over him. His quiet uncle, the man he'd met twice and barely knew, had been running a safe house. For decades. "There are dozens of entries here," Neil said, his voice rough. "Maybe hundreds." Kyle was already scrolling through his phone, searching. Some of these names. Dad, we could find them. Or their families. We could find out who these people were. Neil looked at his son, seeing something he hadn't seen in years. Excitement. Purpose. Kyle's eyes were bright, his fingers moving quickly across his phone screen. We should document everything, Kyle said. Photograph every page, every photo in the hallway. This is history. Hold on, Neil said. We don't know the whole story yet. Maybe there were reasons Harold kept this hidden. Or maybe the reasons don't exist anymore. Maybe these stories deserve to be told. Neil looked down at the ledger, at his uncle's careful handwriting. Each entry represented people, real lives, families who'd needed help and received it. Who was he to keep their stories hidden? But who was he to tell them? Let's take this slow, Neil said. We'll read through everything, figure out what we're dealing with. Then we'll decide. Kyle nodded, but Neil could see his mind already racing ahead. They'd come here expecting nothing more than an abandoned building and maybe a chance to reconnect. Instead, they'd found something that changed everything. Neil ran his hand over the ledger's cover, feeling the worn leather under his palm. The hotel suddenly felt different around him. Not empty, but full. Full of stories, of history, of lives that had passed through these rooms, seeking something as simple and vital as safety. His inheritance wasn't just a building. It was a responsibility he didn't fully understand yet. Outside, the prairie wind picked up, rattling the windows. Neil looked at Kyle, saw his own uncertainty reflected back at him. They'd opened something that had been sealed for decades. Now they had to figure out what to do with it. They spent the first night in the hotel, choosing the 2 least damaged rooms on the 2nd floor. Neil lay awake for hours, listening to the building settle around him. Every creak and groan seemed amplified in the silence. He kept thinking about the names in the ledger, wondering who they'd been, where they'd gone after leaving this place. Morning came with pale light through dusty windows. Neil found Kyle already awake, sitting at the desk in the office with his laptop open and the ledger beside him. Couldn't sleep either, Neil asked. Kyle looked up, his eyes tired but alert. I've been going through entries, cross-referencing with historical records. Dad, this is bigger than we thought. Neil poured coffee from the camping stove they'd set up in the kitchen. The hotel's coffee maker was decades beyond use, but at least the water still ran. He brought 2 cups to the office and sat down beside his son. Show me. Kyle turned the laptop screen. I started with the Green Book theory. Published from 1936 to 1966, it listed safe establishments for black travelers during segregation. But here's the thing. Prairie Vista Hotel isn't listed in any edition I can find. So it wasn't part of that network? Maybe it was unofficial, or maybe it was something else, entirely. Kyle pulled up another window. Look at the dates. The entries start in 1952 and continue through 1979. That's well after segregation ended, at least legally. Neil sipped his coffee, trying to follow. So what was Harold doing? I think he was running a sanctuary, not just for travelers facing discrimination, but for people in trouble. Look at this entry. Kyle pointed to a page in the ledger. June 1968. The Crawford family. Emergency situation. 2 weeks. No questions. That's right after Martin Luther King was assassinated. There were riots, violence, people fleeing dangerous situations. Neil leaned closer, reading the entry. Harold's handwriting was precise, almost clinical, but the words suggested something urgent. Kyle flipped through more pages. And here, multiple entries of Vietnam veterans. Needs time to recover. Struggling with return home. Family can't help. Dad, I think Harold was taking in veterans who couldn't adjust, who needed somewhere quiet. He was a veteran himself, Neil said quietly. Korea. How do you know that? Neil stood and went to the filing cabinet. He'd noticed something the night before, but hadn't thought much of it. He pulled open the bottom drawer and found what he was looking for, a photograph in a frame, face down. He turned it over. 4 young men in military uniforms stood together, arms around each other's shoulders. They were smiling, but their eyes held something else. Exhaustion, maybe, or knowledge that came too early. 3 of the men were black. The 4th was white, younger than the others, his face open and earnest. Neil turned the photo over, written on the back in faded ink. Korea, 1951. Sergeant Harold Carson, Private James Hutchinson, Corporal Marcus. Wait, Kyle interrupted. James Hutchinson. That's the first name in the ledger. Neil checked. Kyle was right. March 12th, 1952. Veteran, Purple Heart, needs rest. Wife and infant daughter. They stared at each other, the connection clicking into place. Harold served with him, Kyle said. And then, after the war, when Hutchinson needed help, Harold gave it. Neil studied the photograph more carefully. Harold looked impossibly young, barely 20. But something in his expression suggested he'd already seen too much. The man standing beside him, James Hutchinson, had his hand on Harold's shoulder, protective, fraternal. They were friends, Neil said. Kyle was already typing into his laptop. James Hutchinson, Korean War veteran, Purple Heart. He paused, scanning results. There's an obituary here. Died in 2018, age 91. Survived by his daughter, Pearl Hutchinson, and 2 grandsons. His daughter, Neil repeated. The infant mentioned in the ledger. She'd be in her 70s now, living in Omaha. Kyle looked up. We could contact her, ask if she knows anything about this place. Neil felt his stomach tighten. That's a big step. We'd be opening up people's private history. Or we'd be giving them answers. Maybe she never knew why her father came here, what Harold did for them. Neil picked up the photograph again, studying Harold's young face. His uncle had kept all of this secret for decades. There had to be a reason. But Kyle was right, too. The people Harold had helped, or their families, might want to know. Might need to know. Let me think about it, Neil said. They spent the morning exploring the second floor more thoroughly. Each room told a small story. In one, they found a child's drawing tucked behind a dresser, a house with a family standing in front, stick figures holding hands. In another, someone had carved initials into the windowsill. JW plus ML, 1964. The room at the far end of the hallway was different from the others. The door had a reinforced lock on the inside, and when they opened it, they found the ceiling painted with stars. Hundreds of them. Glow-in-the-dark stickers arranged in constellations. Kyle stood in the center of the room, looking up. Someone made this for a child. Neil felt something catch in his throat. He imagined Harold up on a ladder, carefully placing each star, making this room special for a frightened child who needed to feel safe. He cared, Neil said, really cared. Beneath a loose floorboard near the window, Kyle found a small wooden toy train. It was hand-carved, simple but skillfully made. On the bottom, someone had burned initials. JW. Same initials as the windowsill, Kyle said, turning the train over in his hands. Neil took it gently. The wood was smooth, worn by small hands. Someone had spent hours carving this, making something beautiful for a child. He thought of Kyle at that age, playing with trucks and trains, the way all little boys did. How quickly that time had passed. I wasn't there enough, Neil said suddenly. When you were growing up, I was always working. Kyle looked at him, surprised. Dad, I'm not fishing for anything. I'm just saying it. I thought if I worked enough, made enough money, that would be enough. But I missed too much. Your school plays, baseball games. I was always on some job site. Kyle set down his laptop. You were trying to provide. I understand that now. Do you? I'm 28, Dad. I understand things I didn't at 15. Kyle picked up the toy train again. But yeah, it hurt. Feeling like work was more important than I was. Neil nodded slowly. It wasn't. But I didn't know how else to show I cared. Keeping a roof over our heads, food on the table. That was the language I knew. I know that now. They sat in silence for a moment, the toy train between them. Outside, wind moved through the tall grass, making it ripple like water. When your mother and I split, Neil said, I thought about fighting for custody. But I was honest with myself. I was never home. You needed stability. She could give you that. You could have visited more. I should have. I was angry, hurt, ashamed. Not at you, at myself. For failing at marriage, for not being the father you deserved. It was easier to work, to stay away. Kyle was quiet for a long time. Then, I'm glad I came on this trip. Me too. And Dad? We're here now. That counts for something. Neil felt his eyes sting. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Kyle stood and walked to the window, looking out over the prairie. I think we should call Pearl Hutchinson. Tell her what we found. Give her a chance to know this part of her father's story. Neil joined him at the window. And if she doesn't want to know? If this is painful for her? Then we apologize and let it go. But we should give her the choice. Neil thought about Harold, about the promises he'd made to the men he served with, about the decades he'd spent keeping those promises, asking nothing in return, about the toy train carved with love for a child who'd needed safety. Okay, he said. We'll call her. Neil dialed the number 3 times before letting it ring through. Each time he hung up before the first ring finished, his thumb hovering over the end call button like it might save him from a mistake. Kyle watched from across the office. Want me to do it? No, I should. Neil hit dial again, and this time forced himself to let it ring. A woman's voice answered on the 3rd ring. Hello? Is this Pearl Hutchinson? Yes, who's calling? Neil cleared his throat. My name is Neil Carson. I'm calling about my uncle, Harold Carson. I believe he knew your father. Silence on the other end. Then, I'm sorry, I don't recognize that name. Harold ran a hotel in Nebraska, the Prairie Vista Hotel. Your father stayed there in 1952, right after he came back from Korea. More silence. Neil could hear her breathing, could almost feel her trying to decide whether to hang up. How did you get my number? She asked carefully. I inherited the hotel when Harold passed. We found records, a ledger with names and dates. Your father's name was in it. James Hutchinson, March 12th, 1952. The entry says he was a veteran with a Purple Heart, that he had a wife and infant daughter. That's my father, she said, her voice softer now. But I don't know anything about any hotel in Nebraska. Could I read you the entry? Maybe it'll mean something to you. Pearl was quiet for a moment. All right. Neil opened the ledger to the first page, ran his finger down to the entry. It says, James Hutchinson, March 12th, 1952. Veteran, Purple Heart, needs rest. Wife and infant daughter. Sanctuary provided. He heard her inhale sharply. Miss Hutchinson? Read that last part again. Sanctuary provided. Oh my God, she whispered. He talked about an angel in Nebraska. I never knew what he meant. Neil felt his heart speed up. Can you tell me about that? My father didn't talk much about the war, or about the years right after. But sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, he'd tell my mother stories. I heard some of them when I was older. He said after Korea, he came home different. Couldn't find work, couldn't sleep, couldn't be around people. My mother was scared. They had me, just a baby, and nowhere to go. They drove for days, looking for somewhere they could rest, somewhere that would take them in. He said most places turned them away. But then they found an angel in Nebraska, a white man who asked no questions, charged almost nothing, and let them stay until my father could breathe again. Neil looked at Kyle, who was listening intently. That was Harold. My uncle. Your uncle saved my father's life. He told my mother that many times, said if they hadn't found that place, he doesn't know what would have happened. How long did they stay? I don't know exactly. Weeks, maybe a month. But it was long enough. When they left, my father was able to face the world again. He got work, settled down, raised me and my brothers, all because someone gave him time to heal. Neil felt the weight of it, the simple, profound fact of it. His uncle had given this man time. Nothing more complicated than that, just time and safety. Miss Hutchinson, would you want to see the place? The hotel is still standing. We're trying to understand what Harold was doing here, who he helped. There were others. The ledger has hundreds of entries, spanning almost 30 years. She was quiet so long, Neil thought the connection had dropped. Then, I'd like to see it, and I'd like to bring my sons. They should know this story. They made arrangements for the following week. After Neil hung up, he sat staring at the phone in his hand. Kyle was grinning. That was incredible, Dad. She never knew, all these years, and she never knew the specifics. Now she will. They spent the afternoon making the hotel presentable. Neil boarded up the worst of the broken windows, swept debris from the porch, cleared weeds from the front walk. Kyle worked on documenting everything, photographing each page of the ledger, each photograph in the hallway, creating a digital archive. In the basement, they found more evidence of the hotel's secret purpose. Old suitcases stacked in a corner, some still packed with clothing from decades past. A worn Bible with family names written inside the front cover. The Washburn family, with birth dates for children ranging from 1944 to 1959. A guest book fragment showing people checking in, but no checkout dates recorded. They stayed longer than normal hotel guests, Kyle observed. Some of these don't have checkout dates at all. Neil found a receipt book in a filing cabinet. Harold's handwriting filled the pages, but the amounts listed were tiny. $5 for a week, $10 for a month. Some entries just said, settled, with no amount listed at all. He wasn't running a business, Neil said. He was running a charity. They found financial records showing Harold had subsidized the hotel from his own savings. He'd worked other jobs, equipment operator, night watchman, whatever paid enough to keep the hotel running and the doors open for people who needed them. Neil sat on the basement steps, holding Harold's financial ledger in his hands. His uncle had given everything to this place, to these people. No recognition, no thanks expected. Just quiet, steady service year after year. I visited him twice, Neil said. My whole life, and I only came twice. Kyle sat beside him. You didn't know. I should have known, should have tried to know him. Maybe this is your chance, to know him now, through what he built. Neil looked at his son. When did you get so wise? Kyle smiled. I had a good teacher. You just didn't realize you were teaching. That evening, they sat on the front porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. The sky turned orange, then pink, then deep purple. Stars began to appear, more than Neil had seen in years. In Cleveland, light pollution washed them out. Here, they filled the sky. "I've been thinking," Kyle said, "about what we do with this information. If we go public with it, there'll be attention. Media, historians, maybe government people wanting to designate it historically significant. That sounds like you've already decided we should go public. Haven't you? Pearl deserves to know. But so do all the other families, the people Harold helped, or their children, their grandchildren. This is their history too." Neil knew Kyle was right, but something held him back. What if Harold wanted it kept private? He sealed that ledger behind a false wall for a reason. Maybe to protect the people he helped, but they're not in danger anymore. Those days are past. Are they? Kyle considered that. Fair point, but I think the good outweighs the risk. These stories deserve to be told. Even if it means we lose control of the property, if it becomes historically significant, we might not be able to sell it, might have to maintain it according to certain standards. Would you want to sell it? Neil hadn't thought about it directly until that moment, but the answer came immediately. No, I don't think I would. Then what's the problem? The responsibility. What if I'm not up to it? What if I can't do right by Harold's legacy? Kyle was quiet for a moment. Then, Dad, you've spent your whole life building things, fixing things. This is just another project. Except this time, you're not alone. I'll help. You have your own life, your job in Chicago. Jobs change. Life changes. Kyle looked out at the darkening prairie. This feels important, more important than designing websites for companies I don't care about. Neil felt something shift in his chest, something tight loosening. You'd really stay? Help me with this? Not stay permanently, but visit, help get things set up, document other sites if they exist. Make this my project, too. They sat in comfortable silence as full dark settled over the land. Inside the hotel, lights glowed warmly. The building that had seemed dead when they arrived now felt alive, full of purpose, waiting to be reclaimed. We'll call some historians, Neil said finally. See what they think. Then we'll decide together. Kyle nodded. Together. I like that. Kyle found the first breakthrough 3 days later. He'd been systematically searching online records, cross-referencing names from the ledger with obituaries, census data, military records, anything that might tell them who these people had been and where they'd gone. Dad, come look at this. Neil set down the paintbrush he'd been using to touch up the lobby trim and joined Kyle at the makeshift desk they'd set up. Warren Hutchinson, Kyle said, pointing at the screen. Listed in the ledger, June 1967. The obituary says he died in 2018 at age 93. But look at the survivors, a daughter living in Omaha. Pearl's family? No, different branch. This is James Hutchinson's brother. They both came through here, just 15 years apart. Kyle pulled up another window. And there's more. I found a Western Union telegram in one of the filing cabinets. He showed Neil the yellowed paper, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. The text was brief. Package arriving. Tuesday stop 3. Souls stop. Handle with care. Stop. Package, Neil said. That's people. Had to be coded. If someone intercepted it, they wouldn't know what it meant. Kyle pulled out a folded paper from the same file. And this was with it. The paper was a hand-drawn map, showing routes across Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. Certain towns were marked with symbols, a circle, a star, an X. Along the margins, someone had written notes in pencil. Friendly. Safe overnight. Avoid after dark. Neil traced the routes with his finger. The map showed a network, a carefully planned system of safe houses and dangerous areas. Prairie Vista Hotel was marked with a star and the words Sanctuary HC. This was organized, Kyle said. Not just Harold, helping people on his own. He was part of something bigger. Neil felt the magnitude of it settling over him. His uncle hadn't just been kind. He'd been part of a coordinated effort to move people to safety. The risks involved, the planning required, the absolute commitment it demanded. "We need to talk to experts," Neil said. "People who study this period, who can put it in context." Kyle was already typing. Nebraska Historical Society has a civil rights specialist, and there's a professor at the University of Nebraska who wrote a book about informal safe house networks during the 1960s. Call them. By the end of the day, they had appointments set. Dr. Clarence Dubois from the Historical Society would visit in 2 days. Professor Fiona Kress, the civil rights historian, would come the following week. That night, Pearl Hutchinson called. "Mr. Carson, I've been thinking about what you told me, about my father's brother Warren, also staying at that hotel. I never knew that. It makes me wonder how many other stories are hidden in that ledger of yours." "Dozens at least," Neil said. "Maybe more. Would you mind if I came sooner and brought my sons? We'd like to help if we can. Documenting, researching, whatever you need." "We'd welcome that, Miss Hutchinson. Please call me Pearl. If your uncle helped my father, we're family in a way." She arrived 2 days later with her sons, Christopher and Jerome, both men in their 40s. Pearl was small and elegant, her grey hair pulled back, her eyes sharp and kind. She carried a shoebox carefully, like it held something precious. Neil gave them a tour, showing them the lobby, the guest rooms, the office where they'd found the ledger. When they reached the room with stars on the ceiling, Pearl stopped in the doorway. "My father painted stars for me," she said quietly. "On my bedroom ceiling when I was little. He said everyone needs stars to guide them home." Her sons stood beside her, seeing their grandfather in a new light through this strange connection across decades. In the office, Pearl opened the shoebox. Inside were letters, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. "My mother kept these. She wouldn't say who they were from, but after she passed, I found them in her things." Pearl handed one to Neil. "Look at the signature." The letter was written in the same precise handwriting as the ledger entries. It was signed simply H. "My mother corresponded with your uncle for years," Pearl said, "long after they left the hotel. She wanted to thank him, to let him know how my father was doing. He always wrote back, asking about us, never mentioning himself." Neil read the letter, dated 1965. Harold asked about Pearl's schooling, about her father's health, expressed quiet happiness that they were doing well. The tone was warm but humble, deflecting any praise. Kyle photographed each letter with Pearl's permission. There were 11 in total, spanning from 1953 to 1978. They painted a picture of Harold as someone who cared deeply about the people he'd helped, but never sought credit or acknowledgement. "He made a difference," Pearl said, touching the ledger gently. "For so many people. That deserves to be remembered." When Dr. Dubois arrived that afternoon, Pearl was still there. The historian was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and glasses that constantly slid down his nose. He approached the ledger like it was made of glass. "Remarkable," he said, carefully turning pages. "The detail, the preservation. Do you know how rare this is?" "Rare how?" Neil asked. Most safe houses from this era didn't keep records. too dangerous. The ones that did usually destroyed them eventually. Physical evidence like this, intact, detailed, spanning decades, it's almost unheard of. He examined the telegram and map next, his excitement growing. These symbols match other networks we've documented. This wasn't isolated. Your uncle was connected to a larger movement. Professor Kress arrived 3 days later and confirmed Dubois' assessment. She was younger, intense, her passion for the subject evident in every gesture. The Green Book era is well documented, she explained, but the informal networks that continued after, especially helping veterans and families escaping violence, that history is fragmented. Sites like this, with this level of documentation, are invaluable. She walked through the hotel with reverence, taking notes, asking questions. In the basement, she found something they'd missed, a false panel in the wall, similar to the one in the office. Behind it were more documents, newspaper clippings about racial violence in neighboring states, notices about Klan activity, maps marking dangerous areas. He was gathering intelligence, Fiona said, warning people, keeping them safe by knowing where the threats were. Neil felt the full weight of Harold's work. His uncle hadn't just provided shelter, he'd actively worked to protect people from danger. That evening, with Pearl, her sons, and the 2 historians present, they discussed what to do next. This needs to be preserved, Dubois said, officially designated as a historic site. That means restrictions, Neil said, on what I can do with the property. True, but it also means funding. Grants for restoration, maintenance, educational programming. This could become a museum, a teaching site. Pearl leaned forward. I'd like to contribute financially. My father's story is part of this place. I want to help preserve it. Her sons nodded in agreement. Our grandfather's legacy, Christopher said. We never knew the full story. Now we do. We want others to know it too. Neil looked at Kyle, who smiled encouragingly. All right, Neil said. Let's do it. Let's preserve this place and tell these stories properly. The room erupted in quiet excitement. Plans being made, phone calls being scheduled, futures being shaped. Neil sat back, watching his son work alongside Pearl's sons, watching the historians pore over documents with careful joy. Harold had built something that lasted beyond his life. Now Neil had the chance to make sure it lasted beyond his own. It felt like the most important work he'd ever done. The week leading up to the media announcement felt like standing at the edge of something vast. Neil woke each morning with purpose, an unfamiliar sensation after years of just getting by. The hotel transformed around them as work crews hired by the Historical Society stabilized the structure, replaced broken windows, brought the building back from the edge of collapse. But it was the emotional work that changed everything. Pearl returned with photographs her father had kept in a trunk. Black and white images of a young couple standing in front of the hotel, the woman holding an infant wrapped in a blanket. On the back, her father had written, "Safe at last. March 1952. That's me, Pearl said, pointing to the bundle in her mother's arms. I was 3 months old. Neil set the photograph beside the ledger entry. The dates matched perfectly. The reality of it struck him. This wasn't just history. These were real people, real moments, real lives saved. Christopher, Pearl's eldest son, had taken time off from his job as an engineer to help catalog artifacts. My kids need to know this story, he said, carefully labeling a box of documents. They need to know their great-grandfather was a hero, and that a white man in Nebraska risked everything to help him. Jerome, quieter than his brother, spent hours in the room with the painted stars. My grandfather told me once that the hardest thing about coming home from war was feeling like you didn't belong anywhere anymore. Your uncle gave him a place to belong, even if just for a while. The historians brought colleagues. Soon the hotel buzzed with activity. Photographers documenting every corner, researchers cross-referencing entries, preservation specialists assessing artifacts. Clarence Dubois coordinated everything with efficient enthusiasm. "We need to go public soon," he told Neil, "before word leaks out improperly. Better to control the narrative from the start." "What if people react badly?" Neil asked. "What if there's backlash?" Fiona looked up from her laptop. "There will be. There always is when you shine light on uncomfortable truths. Some people prefer history stay buried. But more people will celebrate it," Pearl added. "More people need to hear these stories." They planned a press conference for the following week. Local media first, then regional. Clarence assured them national outlets would pick it up quickly. Neil's stomach churned thinking about it. He was a construction worker, not a spokesman. But Kyle reminded him, "You're Harold's nephew, his family. That makes you the right person to tell this story." The night before the media announcement, Neil couldn't sleep. He walked through the hotel in the dark, running his hands along walls that had sheltered so many. In the lobby he found Kyle sitting alone, laptop open. "Can't sleep either?" Neil asked. Kyle shook his head. "Nervous. What if I documented something wrong? What if I missed something important?" Neil sat beside his son. "You've done incredible work. Harold would be proud." "You think so?" "I know so." Kyle closed his laptop. "Dad, I've been thinking about Chicago, my job, all of it." Neil waited. "I want to do this full time. Document other sites like this one. Tell these stories. The Historical Society offered me a position. Contract work, flexible, but meaningful. I'd be based here part of the year, traveling the rest." "What about your apartment, your life in Chicago?" "That wasn't really a life. It was just existing. This," Kyle gestured at the hotel around them, "this matters. And doing it with you, learning from you, that matters too." Neil felt his throat tighten. "I don't want you giving up your career for me." "I'm not. I'm choosing a better one. One that means something." Kyle met his eyes. "We lost a lot of years, Dad. I'd like to make up for some of that." Neil pulled his son into a hug, something he hadn't done since Kyle was small. They held on for a long moment, all the missed connections of the past finally beginning to mend. The press conference was held in the Whitman Community Center. Neil wore his best shirt, still not great, but Kyle had helped him pick it out. Pearl sat beside him at the table, her sons behind her. The historians flanked them, ready to provide context. The room filled quickly. Local newspaper reporters, TV crews from Omaha and Lincoln, a few national stringers who'd heard rumors. Neil spotted some protesters outside through the window, holding signs that read, "Leave the past alone and stop dividing us." His hands trembled as Clarence opened the proceedings. "Thank you all for coming. What we're about to share is a piece of Nebraska history that has remained hidden for over 40 years. The Prairie Vista Hotel, which you see behind me in these photographs, was more than just a place of lodging. It was a sanctuary. Clarence outlined the basics, the ledger, the dates, Harold's service record, the network of safe houses. Then he introduced Neil. Neil's voice shook at first. He told the story simply. The inheritance, the discovery, the realization of what Harold had done. He held up the photograph of Harold in his military uniform. "My uncle was 20 years old in this picture. He made promises to the men he served with, that if they survived, they'd have help when they got home. He kept those promises for 30 years. He asked for nothing, He expected nothing. He just did what he believed was right. Kyle presented the digital archive, projecting images on a screen, ledger pages, photographs, the telegram, the map. Each image drew murmurs from the crowd. Then Pearl spoke. Her voice was steady, clear. My father returned from Korea with wounds that couldn't be seen. He was a decorated soldier who came home to a country that wouldn't let him stay in most hotels. He and my mother drove for days with me, an infant, looking for somewhere safe to rest. Harold Carson gave them that. Because of him, my father had time to heal. Because of him, I grew up with a father who was present, who was whole. She showed her parents' photograph, the one labeled "Safe at Last." That baby in the picture became a nurse. I've spent 45 years caring for people. My sons are both successful men with families of their own. All of that exists because one person chose compassion over fear. That ripple effect, that's what Harold Carson created. The room was silent, except for the click of cameras. Questions came rapid fire. How many people did Harold help? How was this kept secret so long? What happened to the others in the ledger? Fiona fielded most of them, providing historical context, explaining the networks, the dangers people faced, the courage required to help. One reporter asked Neil directly, "Did you know any of this about your uncle?" "No," Neil admitted. "I met him twice in my life. I barely knew him. But I'm getting to know him now, through what he built, and I'm honored to preserve his legacy." Another question. What about the protesters outside? How do you respond to people who say this is divisive? Neil paused, choosing his words carefully. These aren't opinions or political positions. These are lives, real people who needed help and received it. If documenting that makes anyone uncomfortable, maybe that discomfort is worth examining. The press conference lasted 90 minutes. Afterward, reporters surrounded them, asking follow-ups, requesting private interviews. Pearl handled it with grace, her sons providing support. Kyle documented everything, his camera constantly clicking. Outside, as they left, one of the protesters approached, an older man with weathered features. He held his sign limply at his side. "My grandfather turned people away," he said quietly. "From his business, his land. Said he was protecting what was his. Hearing all this today, I don't know anymore. Maybe he was protecting the wrong things." He handed Neil his sign and walked away. Neil looked down at it. Preserve history, not myths. "Small victories?" Kyle said softly. "They add up," Neil replied. The basement had been thoroughly searched, or so they thought. But renovation work required removing old shelving units, and that's when the crowbar slipped between loose bricks near the foundation. Neil felt them shift under pressure, heard the hollow sound that meant empty space behind. "Kyle, hand me the flashlight." His son scrambled over, shining light into the gap as Neil pried away more bricks. Behind them was a small cavity, and inside it sat a metal box, rusted but intact. Neil pulled it out carefully, feeling the weight of it. "What is it?" Kyle asked. "Don't know yet." They carried it upstairs to the office where the light was better. The box was locked, but the mechanism was so corroded that Neil's screwdriver made quick work of it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was another journal, smaller than the ledger, more personal. The cover was plain leather, no embossing, no title. Neil opened it carefully. The first page stopped him cold. Harold's handwriting, but different from the ledger, looser, more emotional. January 15th, 1952. I made a promise to James and the others. If we survived, I would help them survive what comes after. The war doesn't end just because you come home. I see that now. James showed up today with his wife and baby. He couldn't find work, couldn't find a place that would take them. I gave them a room. It's the least I can do. Neil turned pages, reading entries that spanned decades. Unlike the ledger's clinical records, this was deeply personal. Harold's private thoughts, fears, moral struggles. Kyle read over his shoulder, both of them silent, as the entries revealed a man they hadn't fully understood. March 1954. Word is spreading. People contact me through channels I don't fully understand. They need help. I'm not equipped for this, but I'm here. The hotel is here. What else can I do but say yes? June 1959. The sheriff came by today asking questions about my clientele. I played dumb. He looked at me like he knew I was lying, but couldn't prove it. Need to be more careful. If they shut me down, where will people go? November 1963. President Kennedy was killed today. The country is in shock. I received a telegram tonight. Family needs emergency sanctuary. They witnessed something, are being threatened to stay quiet. I said yes, immediately. 3 weeks hiding them. Arranged transport north under cover. I don't sleep much anymore. Neil's hands shook as he read. This wasn't passive charity. Harold had been actively intervening, taking real risks, possibly breaking laws. Dad, look at this one. Kyle pointed to an entry from 1967. April 1967. The Morrison family barely escaped with their lives. The father testified against white men who assaulted a black teenager. Now they're marked. I kept them here 3 weeks, watching the road every night with a shotgun across my lap. Local clan left a note on my truck. Watch yourself. I burned it. What are they going to do? Kill an old white man? Maybe. But these children deserve to live. That's worth the risk. Neil sat back, his heart pounding. He was in danger. Real danger. Kyle continued reading aloud. July 1968. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing more harm than good. By helping, am I putting people at greater risk? But then I remember James. How broken he was when he arrived. How whole he was when he left. I remember the children who played in the Star Room, who felt safe for the first time in months. That has to count for something. October 1972. Got word that one of the families I helped, the Washburns, their daughter became a civil rights attorney. She's fighting for others now. Some people call me foolish for what I do. I call it paying forward what I owe. Every person I help is a debt repaid to the men who kept me alive in Korea. The entries continued, each one revealing more about Harold's motivations, his methods, his network. He tracked clan activity, shared intelligence with other safe houses, arranged transportation, provided false information to authorities when necessary. This changes everything, Neil said quietly. How? He wasn't just helping people. He was actively obstructing hate groups, misleading law enforcement, running what was essentially an underground railroad. If we make this public, if we tell the whole truth, people might attack his memory, Kyle finished. Say he was breaking the law, harboring criminals, whatever they can twist it into. Neil kept reading. The entries from the late 1970s showed Harold aging, his energy waning, his resources depleting. March 1979. My hands shake now. Can't do the physical work I used to. But the calls still come. How can I stop when people still need help? December 1981. I closed the hotel today. My health won't allow me to continue. I pray I did enough. I pray the people I helped found peace. I pray I'm remembered right, if I'm remembered at all. The final entry was dated January 1982, just months before Harold sealed the place up completely. I've hidden the records where they'll be safe. Maybe someday someone will find them and understand. Maybe not. What matters is the people who passed through these doors, who found safety when the world offered none. That's the real story. Not me. Them. Neil closed the journal carefully. In the bottom of the metal box were more items, a collection of letters, dozens of them, rubber-banded together. He opened one at random. "Dear Harold, you saved my daughter's life. We will never forget. When we arrived, we had nothing. You asked for nothing. That is grace we can never repay." Another letter. "Because of the time you gave me to heal, I finished college. I'm a teacher now, working with troubled kids. I pass forward what you gave me." Another. "My son graduated medical school yesterday. He exists because you protected us when we had nowhere else to turn. Thank you will never be enough." Letter after letter, spanning decades, people pouring out gratitude for something Harold had done quietly, expecting nothing in return. Kyle's eyes were wet. He kept every letter, but never showed them to anyone, never used them to prove what he'd done. They sat in silence, the weight of Harold's sacrifice settling over them. He'd risked his life, spent his savings, isolated himself from his community, all to keep promises made to soldiers he'd served with decades earlier. And he'd asked for nothing, no recognition, no thanks, not even the comfort of having someone know the full truth. "We have to tell this story completely," Kyle said. "All of it. The risks he took, the laws he might have broken, the danger he faced. People will attack him for it. Let them. The people he saved will defend him. Their children will defend him. History will judge him properly." Neil picked up the photograph of Harold in uniform, so young, so full of unspoken determination. He chose this, knowing the cost. And now we're choosing to honor that, knowing the cost too. Neil thought about the protesters, the skeptics, the people who would twist Harold's courage into something ugly. But he thought too about Pearl, about her father who'd lived 30 more years because of Harold's kindness, about the attorney, the teacher, the doctor. Lives that existed because one man decided that doing right mattered more than staying safe. "We tell the whole truth," Neil said. "Every part of it. We prepare for backlash, but we don't hide anything." Kyle nodded. "When?" "At the unveiling ceremony. We'll present everything. The ledger, this journal, the letters. Let people see the complete picture. Pearl needs to know first." "Agreed. We call her tonight." Neil looked around the office, at the walls that had witnessed so much courage, so much quiet heroism. His inheritance wasn't just property. It was responsibility to a truth that deserved to be told, regardless of the cost. Harold had understood that. Now Neil did too. Pearl arrived the next morning with her sons, and a determination that reminded Neil of Harold. Quiet, but absolute. She'd driven through the night after Neil called her about the journal. "Show me everything," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. They sat in the office, the journal open between them. Pearl read silently, her face composed, but her hands trembling slightly as she turned pages. Christopher and Jerome stood behind her, reading over her shoulders. When she finished, Pearl closed the journal gently and looked at Neil. "My father never told us how dangerous it was. He said Harold was kind, but not this. Not that he risked his life." "I didn't know either," Neil said. "Nobody did." "These letters," Pearl picked up the stack, "these need to be shared. People need to understand what courage actually looks like." Over the next week, they prepared for the unveiling ceremony that would officially designate the hotel as a historic landmark. But now it would be more than a simple celebration. It would be the full revelation of Harold's work, risks and all. Clarence and Fiona helped them plan carefully. "We'll present the facts," Clarence said. "Let people draw their own conclusions." "Some conclusions will be hostile," Fiona warned. "Be prepared for that." They were, but preparation didn't make the first threatening letter any easier to stomach. It arrived 3 days before the ceremony, no return address, postmarked from a town 50 miles away. The message was brief and ugly. "Your uncle was a traitor who harbored criminals and undermined law and order. This so-called sanctuary was a base for troublemakers and agitators. We won't let you turn it into a shrine." Neil reported it to the Afia police, who increased patrols around the hotel. Kyle wanted to hire security for the ceremony. "We're not backing down," Pearl said firmly. "That's exactly what they want." But Neil saw the fear in her eyes, in her son's protective stances. This wasn't just history anymore. It was present danger. A local newspaper ran a preliminary story. The responses online split predictably. Supportive comments from descendants of people Harold had helped, from historians, from civil rights advocates, but also angry denunciations, rewriting history, stirring up division, making heroes out of lawbreakers. Kyle spent hours moderating comments on the digital archive he'd created, deleting threats, reporting harassment. "This is exhausting," he admitted to Neil one night. "We can stop," Neil offered. "We can keep it private, just preserve it without the publicity." "No," Kyle said, though his voice was tired. "That's not honoring Harold. He didn't hide. He just didn't seek attention. There's a difference." More media reached out. A regional news show wanted an interview, a podcast about hidden history, a documentary filmmaker from California. The attention grew faster than they'd anticipated. Pearl did a phone interview with a reporter from Omaha. She spoke carefully but passionately about her father's experience, about what Harold's sanctuary had meant. The interview aired the next day and went viral on social media. Suddenly, the hotel wasn't just a local story. It was national. The National Museum of African American History contacted them, offering to feature artifacts in an upcoming exhibit. A civil rights foundation wanted to establish a scholarship in Harold's name. 2 universities requested permission to bring students for educational visits. "This is bigger than us," Kyle said, overwhelmed by the response. "It always was," Pearl replied. "We're just the messengers." The night before the ceremony, Neil walked through the hotel alone. They'd cleaned it thoroughly, stabilized the structure, made it safe for visitors. Tomorrow, hundreds would come. Media would capture everything. The hotel would officially become part of recorded history. But tonight, it was still just a building where an ordinary man had done extraordinary things. Neil climbed to the 2nd floor, entered the room with painted stars. Someone, probably Pearl, had placed flowers on the windowsill. The toy train sat in a display case, protected now, preserved for people to see. He imagined the child who'd played with it, whoever J.W. had been. A child frightened, displaced, seeking safety, and Harold had given that, had made this room special just for them. Kyle found him there. "Couldn't sleep. Too much in my head." "Me too." Kyle sat on the floor, back against the wall. Neil joined him. "I keep thinking about tomorrow," Kyle said. "What if we mess this up? What if we say the wrong thing or present it wrong? We tell the truth. That's all we can do. What if the truth isn't enough?" Neil considered that. "Then we live with it. But we'll have done right by Harold, by the people he helped. That has to matter." They sat in silence, father and son, in a room that represented everything they'd discovered. About Harold, about themselves, about what it meant to choose courage over comfort. "I'm proud of you," Neil said suddenly. "The work you've done, documenting all this, creating the archive. You made this possible." Kyle's voice was thick. "I'm proud of you too, Dad. You could have sold this place, taken the money, walked away. But you didn't. Couldn't. Not once I understood what it meant." "That's character," Kyle said. "That's what Harold had. And I see it in you." Neil felt his eyes burn. "I wish I'd known him, really known him. You're getting to, through this. And maybe that's what he wanted, for someone to understand after he was gone, to carry it forward." They stayed in the star room until dawn began to lighten the sky. Then they went downstairs together, made coffee on the camping stove, prepared for what would come. Pearl arrived early with her sons, carrying more flowers. "My father would have wanted to be here today," she said. "But we're here for him." The Washburn family representative called, Margaret, the elderly woman whose family Harold had hidden in 1962. She'd be there, traveling from Minnesota with her children and grandchildren. Another call came from a man named Hosea Freeman. "I stayed at the hotel in 1968, he said. 3 days that saved my life. I'd like to attend the ceremony if that's allowed." "Please come," Neil said. "Please." By mid-morning, people were already gathering. News vans parked along the road. Reporters set up equipment. A crowd formed, some supportive, some curious, some there to protest. Neil saw the signs. "Preserve truth, not propaganda. Stop race baiting. Leave history alone." His stomach clenched, but Pearl touched his arm. "For every person with a sign, there are 5 more who want to hear this story. Remember that." Clarence checked the audio equipment, the projector for Kyle's presentation, the podium where they'd speak. Everything was ready. At noon they would unveil the restored hotel sign and the new plaque commemorating Harold's work. They would tell the complete story, the journal, the letters, the risks, the courage. Neil put on his sport coat. Kyle had pinned Harold's bronze star to the lapel. The historians had found it at the bottom of the metal box, wrapped in tissue paper, never displayed. "You ready?" Kyle asked. Neil looked at his son, at Pearl and her family, at the hotel standing solid behind them. He thought of Harold, young and determined, in that faded photograph, making promises he'd spend his life keeping. "Yeah," Neil said. "I'm ready." They walked toward the ceremony together, toward whatever would come, carrying Harold's truth into the light. The community center was packed beyond capacity. People stood along the walls, sat in the aisles, crowded around the doorway. Cameras lined the back row, their red lights glowing. Neil's hands shook as he took his seat at the front table. Pearl sat beside him, her face calm. Kyle was at the laptop, ready to project images. Clarence stood at the podium, waiting for the murmur of voices to quiet. "Thank you all for coming," Clarence began. "What we share today is a story of courage that remained hidden for 40 years. The Prairie Vista Hotel, which stands just 2 miles from where we sit, was more than a place of lodging. It was a sanctuary in the truest sense, a refuge for those who had nowhere else to turn." He outlined the discovery, the letter, the ledger, the journal. The crowd listened intently, some taking notes, others simply absorbing. "I'd like to introduce Neil Carson, nephew of Harold Carson, who inherited this property and brought this history to light." Neil stood on unsteady legs and moved to the podium. The microphone squealed briefly before settling. He looked out at the sea of faces, some friendly, some skeptical, some openly hostile. "I barely knew my uncle," Neil began, his voice rough. "I met Harold Carson twice in my life. at a family reunion when I was a boy, and at my grandmother's funeral 20 years ago. That was it. No phone calls, no letters, no relationship. When I inherited the hotel, I expected nothing more than an old building and maybe a fresh start. He paused, gathering himself. Instead, I found a legacy I didn't understand and didn't deserve. My uncle was 20 years old when he went to Korea. He served with men who became his brothers. When they came home to a country that wouldn't let them stay in hotels or eat in restaurants, Harold made a promise. If they survived, they'd have help. Neil held up the photograph of Harold in uniform, and Kyle projected it on the screen behind him. He kept that promise for 30 years. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't do it for money. In fact, he spent his own savings keeping the hotel running. He did it because it was right. The room was silent, except for camera shutters clicking. Kyle advanced the slides, pages from the ledger, entries showing names and dates. Each one drew murmurs from the crowd. "These aren't just records," Neil continued. "These are lives, real people who needed sanctuary and found it." He showed the telegram, the hand-drawn map with its coded warnings and safe routes. My uncle was part of a network. He gathered intelligence about threats, warned travelers about dangerous areas, coordinated with other safe houses. He took risks that could have cost him his freedom, maybe his life. Neil's voice strengthened as he spoke. This was Harold's story, and it deserved to be told clearly. We found his personal journal. In it, he describes sleepless nights, watching the road with a shotgun, threatening letters left on his truck, close calls with authorities who suspected what he was doing. But he also wrote about children's laughter, families reunited, veterans finding peace. Kyle projected an entry from 1972. Neil read it aloud. "Some call me foolish. I call it paying forward what I owe." Several people in the audience wiped their eyes. Harold Carson earned this bronze star in Korea. Neil touched the medal pinned to his jacket. But his real heroism came after, in the quiet daily choice to help people when no one was watching, when no one would thank him, when doing so put him in danger. He stepped back from the podium. "I regret that I never knew him, never asked about his life, never understood what he sacrificed. But I'm here now to make sure his story, and the stories of the people he helped, are remembered correctly." Clarence returned to introduce Pearl. She moved to the podium with dignity, carrying the photograph of her parents, standing in front of the hotel. "My name is Pearl Hutchinson. This is my mother and father in March 1952. Kyle projected the image large on the screen. "I'm the infant my mother is holding. I was 3 months old." Pearl's voice was steady, clear. "My father, James Hutchinson, served in Korea with Harold Carson. He came home with a Purple Heart and wounds that couldn't be seen. He struggled to find work, struggled to find places that would accept his family. They drove for days, turned away repeatedly, running out of money and hope." She paused, looking at the photograph on the screen. "Harold gave them sanctuary. Not for a night, but for weeks. He charged almost nothing. He asked no questions. He gave my father time to heal, space to find himself again. Because of Harold Carson, my father lived 30 more productive years. He raised me and my brothers. He worked, contributed to his community, found peace." Pearl looked out at the audience. "I became a nurse. I've spent 45 years caring for people. My sons are engineers. Between them, they have 5 children. All of us exist because one man chose compassion over fear, justice over prejudice, courage over safety." Her voice grew stronger. "That's not politics. That's not division. That's humanity at its best." The applause started small but built, filling the room. Some people stood, then more. Soon most of the room was on its feet, But not everyone. Neil saw some people sitting, arms crossed, faces hard. The protesters outside had grown in number. This story wouldn't be universally accepted. He'd known that, but seeing it still hurt. The question period began carefully. A reporter from Lincoln asked about verification. Fiona stepped forward with binders full of documentation. We've cross-referenced every entry with public records, military documents, census data. We've authenticated the journal through handwriting analysis and period-appropriate paper. Multiple families have come forward, confirming their connection to entries in the ledger. The evidence is substantial and verified. A local reporter asked, what about the laws he might have broken, hiding people from authorities? Clarence fielded that one. Historical context matters. The laws he may have violated were often unjust laws enforcing segregation and discrimination. We're not here to retry legal questions from 60 years ago. We're here to document what happened and why it mattered. A skeptical voice from the back. How do you respond to people who say this is just stirring up old resentments? Neil returned to the podium. These aren't resentments. They're stories of survival, of human dignity, of extraordinary moral courage. If documenting that makes anyone uncomfortable, perhaps that discomfort is worth examining. These aren't opinions. These are lives, real people who needed help and received it from someone brave enough to provide it. The response was mixed. Some applause, some murmurs of disagreement. Another question, this time gentler. What would Harold think about this attention? Neil smiled sadly. He'd probably hate it. He kept these secrets for good reasons, protecting people he helped, avoiding recognition, staying safe. But those reasons don't exist anymore. The people he saved want him remembered. Their children and grandchildren deserve to know this history. I think he'd be uncomfortable with praise, but proud that the truth is finally known. Kyle spoke for the first time. We're not making him a saint. We're showing he was human, afraid sometimes, lonely often. But he chose courage anyway. That's the story worth telling. The press conference shifted to questions about the future. Clarence outlined the preservation plans, grants secured, restoration scheduled, educational programs being developed. The hotel would become a museum and teaching site, open to the public within the year. Pearl announced her family's financial contribution. This is our way of honoring my father and Harold Carson. We want students to visit, to learn, to understand what courage looks like in practice. A filmmaker asked about documentary rights. We're in discussions, Kyle said, but any project has to center the people Harold helped, not just Harold himself. Their stories matter most. A college professor raised her hand. Would you be open to educational visits? I teach civil rights history. My students need to see places like this. Absolutely, Neil said. That's the point, to teach, to remember, to learn. More questions came about the digital archive, about other potential safe houses, about the network Harold had been part of. Kyle explained his plans to document similar sites across the Midwest, to build a comprehensive record of these informal sanctuaries. Finally, Clarence wrapped up the formal proceedings. Thank you all for your time and attention. We'll have a brief reception, and then tomorrow at 2 o'clock, we'll hold the official unveiling ceremony at the hotel itself. You're all invited. As people filed out, several approached Neil directly. An elderly black woman took his hand. Thank you for honoring this history. My uncle might have stayed at that hotel. I remember family stories about Nebraska, about a safe place. I'm going to research it. A younger man, white, looked uncomfortable. My grandfather owned a hotel in the area. He definitely didn't help people like Harold did. I'm ashamed of that, but grateful someone had the courage. Neil shook hands, accepted thanks, listened to stories. Pearl was surrounded by people wanting to share their own family histories of finding refuge, of being turned away, of the terror and relief that marked those years. The protesters outside had dwindled to a handful. As Neil exited, one older man stepped forward, the same one who'd handed him the sign at the first press conference. "I was wrong," the man said simply, "about what my grandfather did, about why. I've been thinking all week. Sometimes protecting what's yours means protecting others too, not keeping them out." He didn't wait for a response, just nodded and walked away. In the parking lot, Kyle leaned against the truck, exhausted. "That was intense." "You did great," Neil said. "Really great." Pearl joined them with her sons. "One more day," she said. "Tomorrow we make it official." That evening, people began arriving at the hotel spontaneously. They brought flowers, candles, handwritten notes of thanks. By dusk, dozens of people stood in the parking lot, a quiet vigil forming without organization or plan. Neil and Kyle watched from the porch as the crowd grew. Someone started singing, an old hymn, soft and mournful. Others joined in. The sound rose into the prairie evening, carrying across the flat land. An elderly man approached the porch slowly, using a cane. He was thin, his hair white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "Mr. Carson," he said to Neil. "Yes? My name is Hosea Freeman. I called yesterday. I stayed here in 1968. Neil's breath caught. "You were in the ledger." "May 1968. 3 days. It says I needed refuge." Hosea smiled sadly. "That's one way to put it. I was running from people who wanted me dead for registering black voters in Alabama. Harold took me in, no questions, fed me, let me rest. Then he arranged safe transport north to family in Minnesota. Would you like to come in? See the place?" Hosea climbed the porch steps carefully. Inside, he moved through the lobby like a man walking through a memory. He touched the registration desk, ran his fingers along the wall. "It looks the same. Cleaner now, but the same." He turned to Neil. "I wanted to thank Harold. For years I wanted to find him, tell him what that sanctuary meant. But I lost track of the location, couldn't remember the name. When I saw the news story, I knew immediately. That was the place. That was my angel." "He would have been glad to know you made it," Neil said. "I became a teacher, taught for 38 years in Minneapolis, reached thousands of kids, all because Harold gave me 3 days to catch my breath and find my courage again." Hosea's eyes filled. "Can I thank you instead? Since I can't thank him?" Neil stepped forward and embraced the old man. They held on for a long moment while Kyle photographed them quietly, preserving the moment. "He'd be honored," Neil whispered. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for telling us." Hosea stayed for an hour, sharing stories, filling in details about 1968, about the network that had passed him from one safe house to another until he reached safety. Before he left, he wrote a note in the new guest book they'd started. "I was here in 1968, and I'm here again in 2024. Sanctuary then. Sacred ground now. Thank you, Harold Carson. Thank you, Neil Carson." The vigil outside continued into the night. Neil and Kyle joined the crowd eventually, standing among people who understood what this place meant. Some had connections to entries in the ledger. Others just believed the story mattered. A reporter from a national news network approached carefully. "Mr. Carson, we'd like to do a feature story. Not just about the hotel, but about what you and your son have done to preserve it. The reconciliation between you two." That's part of the story, too. Neil looked at Kyle, who shrugged. If it helps people understand, Kyle said. All right, Neil agreed. But tomorrow, after the ceremony. The reporter thanked them and stepped back. As midnight approached, the crowd began to thin. People took their candles, their flowers placed respectfully around the hotel's foundation. The building stood illuminated by flickering light, solid and enduring. Pearl was one of the last to leave. Tomorrow is going to be beautiful, she said. Harold would be proud, uncomfortable but proud. After everyone had gone, Neil and Kyle sat on the porch in the dark, watching stars emerge across the vast prairie sky. We did it, Kyle said quietly. We told his story. We started to, Neil corrected. This is just the beginning. The real work, preservation, education, keeping this alive, that's ahead. Are you ready for it? Neil thought about Harold, about promises kept over decades, about quiet heroism that expected nothing. Yeah, he said. I think I am. We are, Kyle smiled. Tomorrow we make it official. Tomorrow, Neil agreed. They sat together in comfortable silence, father and son, guardians of a legacy they were only beginning to understand, but were determined to honor. Morning arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air. Neil woke early, dressed in the suit Kyle had helped him buy. Nothing fancy, but respectable. He pinned Harold's bronze star to the lapel one more time, feeling the weight of it. The hotel grounds had been transformed. The Historical Society had hired landscapers who'd planted flowers, trimmed grass, cleared away decades of neglect. The building itself stood clean and solid, windows repaired, brick restored to its original deep red. By noon, cars lined the gravel road for half a mile. Over 300 people had come, more than anticipated, more than the small parking area could hold. News crews set up discreetly, respecting the ceremony's solemn nature. Kyle had produced memorial booklets, simple but beautiful, containing photographs from the ledger, excerpts from Harold's journal, and a timeline of the hotel's history. Volunteers distributed them as people arrived. Neil stood near the covered sign, watching the crowd gather. Pearl arrived with her extended family, not just her sons, but cousins, nieces, nephews, her sons' children. 3 generations who existed because Harold had given sanctuary to their ancestor. Margaret Washburn came from Minnesota, 81 years old, but moving with purpose. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her protectively. She'd been 18 when Harold hid her family for 6 weeks in 1962, saving them from violent retaliation after her brother tried to register voters. Hosea Freeman sat in the front row, his cane resting against his chair. Beside him were others who'd made the journey, descendants of names in the ledger, people who'd heard the story and felt compelled to witness. Clarence called the ceremony to order. We gather today to dedicate this site as an official Nebraska historical landmark. But more than that, we gather to honor courage, compassion, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The State Historical Commissioner spoke about the significance of preservation, about teaching difficult history, about the responsibility to remember. Then Pearl took the podium. My father spent his life trying to repay a debt he felt he owed Harold Carson, she said. But Harold never saw it as a debt. He saw it as duty, as promise-keeping, as simple human decency. That's the lesson here. Not that some people are heroes and others aren't, but that we all face choices about who to help and who to turn away. Harold chose help, every time, for 30 years. Margaret spoke next, her voice surprisingly strong. I became a civil rights attorney because of what I learned in this building. I learned that courage doesn't always look like marching or protests. Sometimes it looks like opening a door, offering a room, asking no questions. Harold Carson taught me that justice requires action, not just belief. Hosea stood with effort, waving off help. I'm here because Harold gave me 3 days in 1968. 3 days to rest, to eat, to remember I was human and deserving of dignity. Those 3 days gave me the strength to keep going, to make a life, to teach young people that their lives matter. That's what Sanctuary does. It reminds people they're worth saving. Finally, Neil approached the podium. The crowd quieted. I came here expecting nothing, he said. A broken-down building, maybe a financial burden. Instead, I found purpose. My son and I came here strangers to each other, the distance between us built over years of absence and misunderstanding. This place, this history, brought us back together. He looked at Kyle, who stood beside the covered sign, camera ready. My uncle taught me something without ever knowing me, that legacy isn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It's about showing up, day after day, doing what's right even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. Neil nodded to Kyle. Together, father and son pulled the cord. The cover fell away, revealing the restored sign, Prairie Vista Hotel, in fresh paint, the vintage design faithfully reproduced. Below it, a new bronze plaque read, Prairie Vista Hotel, 1951 to 1982. Harold Carson provided sanctuary to travelers, veterans, and families when refugee was denied elsewhere. Courage is often quiet. Justice is always necessary. And beneath that, in smaller letters, Restored with Love by Neil and Kyle Carson, 2024. The crowd applauded, many wiping tears. Photographers captured the moment. The sign, the building, Neil and Kyle with arms around each other. 3 generations of Pearl's family gathered together. The reception afterward filled the hotel's ground floor. People toured rooms now preserved as they'd been, artifacts displayed behind glass. The ledger sat in a climate-controlled case, opened to significant pages. Harold's journal excerpts covered wall panels, carefully edited but honest. The toy train had its own small display. To the children who found safety here. A college professor approached Neil. I'd like to bring students every semester. Make this part of our curriculum. A documentary filmmaker presented a proposal, respectful and thorough. The story needs to be told properly, with the voices of people Harold helped at the center. A local group wanted to establish a scholarship in Harold's name for students studying social justice. Pearl immediately pledged the first year's funding. The overwhelming response, offers of help, commitments to support, pledges to remember, washed over Neil in waves. Kyle handled it better, taking notes, making connections, organizing the flood of interest into manageable next steps. As afternoon faded to evening, the crowd thinned. Neil found himself alone on the porch, watching the last visitors leave. The prairie stretched in all directions, golden in the sunset light. Pearl joined him. You've done something important here. We all did. But you chose to honor it. You could have walked away, sold it, forgotten about it. Instead, you stayed. You cared. Couldn't do anything else. Not once I understood. That's what Harold would have said. They stood in comfortable silence until Pearl's sons called her to the car. She squeezed Neil's hand once before leaving. Kyle came out, exhausted but smiling. The digital archive crashed from too much traffic. That's a good problem to have. People care, Neil said simply. They do. The sun dropped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Lights inside the hotel glowed warm and welcoming. The building that had stood empty for 40 years was alive, Again, not as a hotel, but as something more important. A reminder, a testament, a promise that courage matters, that kindness echoes across generations, that sanctuary remains sacred. Neil thought about Harold standing here decades ago, watching the same sunset, wondering if anyone would ever know or care what he'd done. "They know now, Uncle Harold," Neil whispered. "They'll remember." Kyle stood beside his father, solid and present. Together they watched darkness settle over the prairie. The hotel behind them lit and enduring, a beacon not for travelers in danger anymore, but for truth that must not be forgotten, for reconciliation between estranged hearts, for proof that ordinary people can choose extraordinary courage. The greatest inheritance wasn't property. It was purpose. It was connection. It was grace.